Okay, so let's start talking about, let's see, resting membrane potential. Okay, so if this is our cell, there's a couple things we need to set up in order to set up our resting membrane potential. Keep in mind that the resting, what we're shooting for at least in this cell, is -70. And there's a couple things that help the cell get down to -7, that's in millivolts. So the first thing is going to be our chemical gradients. So our chemical gradients, we're going to have potassium inside the cell is going to be very concentrated and less concentrated outside the cell. Then we have sodium. Sodium is going to be the opposite. So it's going to be not as concentrated in the cell, but very concentrated outside of the cell. Now, keep in mind that these are ions, and we're talking about a cell membrane here. So they're non-permeable to the cell membrane, which means that they need proteins in order to help them go in and out of the cell. One of those proteins is our ATPase pump for potassium and sodium. So it's gonna put 2 potassium inside the cell, and 3 sodium are going to go outside the cell every time it makes that transfer. And you might think that this, well, let me explain this. Whenever no, that's with the lead channels, never mind. So you might think that this makes up for some of the charge because you have sodium that's moving out. Well, I guess I could explain that now. So sodium and potassium, they all have a negative counterpart. Every single ion will have a negative counterpart that it joins up with. So the sodium leaves behind its negative charges that it was attached to. And now that makes the cell more negative on the inside. Now it doesn't do that much. This next protein, which is the potassium lead channel, this one is actually the main contributor to that -70 millivolts in the cell. And this lead channel, it will just allow potassium to flow down the gradient from high concentration to low concentration. Now, like I said, when it does that, every potassium that leaves has a negative charge that it's attached to. So when that happens, it will separate. So then you just have the potassium ion out here when it moves through, and then you'll have the negative that it left behind, and then you'll have all of these charges that actually accumulate around the cell. And that's what contributes to that. Mostly, the potassium lead channel does. Now, there are a couple things that will affect the cell and where this resting membrane potential will be. And you have things like hypokalemia and hyperkalemia. And then you also have hypo and hypernatremia. So this one, that's for potassium. These two are linked to potassium. And this one's linked to sodium. Now the sodium, like I said before, these are ions, so they can't really get through the cell membrane without help from these proteins. And sodium's only coming out of the cell. But this doesn't really contribute to charge very much, the sodium-potassium pump. So it can't really move down the gradient effectively enough to change this very much. So whether or not you have hypo or hypernatremia, it doesn't really affect your resting membrane potential. It will affect things with action potential, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, hypokalemia and hyperkalemia, that will affect this, your resting membrane potential, because let's say that you have even less potassium outside the cell. Well, that makes your chemical gradient bigger. It makes the difference between those chemical gradients bigger, which means more of your potassium is going to come outside the cell. That will actually drive the cell, because remember, it has to leave its counter charge. It has to leave that negative charge behind whenever it leaves. So you'll actually drive down the cell potential, the resting membrane potential. You know, to negative 80. It might be less than that, it might be more than that, depending on the concentration. On the flip side, you can also make it to where you have more of a concentration on the outside. Oh, I forgot to mention, when we're talking about hypo and hyperkalemia, or natremia or whatever, it's always in reference to the outside of the cell, the extracellular concentration in the extracellular fluid. So yeah, back to this. If you have hyperkalemia, so a ton of potassium on the outside, it will actually make it so that this is not as strong pulling out, so less of your potassium comes out, and you actually end up with a more positive charge, like negative 60, somewhere around there, I guess. That's pretty much what you need to know for resting membrane potential. Now real quick, we'll go over, the Nernst equation and driving force. So this is the Nernst equation right here. It's going to be E is equal to negative 61 Z times the log. Okay, so this is your Nernst equation. It's negative 61 over Z. Z is equal to the charge of the ion. So if you're dealing with potassium, it'd be +1. If you're dealing with chlorine, it'd be -1. Whatever it is, that's the value of Z. And then you're going to have your concentration inside the cell and your concentration outside the cell. And then you'd be able to calculate that out and get this. This is going to be where, just purely, it's talking about purely concentration, where the gradient is going to want to sit for concentration. And then you'll also have your resting membrane potential, which is Vm, and you do your resting membrane potential minus where that specific ion would like to be. Now the reason why we use this is because it tells us in terms of our electrical gradient and our chemical gradient where that ion is going to want to move. So let's say you had potassium. You have potassium, and let's say potassium has the driving force for it ends up being positive. Now, when we're talking about driving force, it's always going to be on the inside of the cell. So it's going to be intercellular. So let's say that it has a positive driving force of, we'll just say 15. Well, potassium's a positively charged ion. If our driving force is positive, it's going to want to leave the cell. Now, if it were negative, it would want to come into the cell. But look at our concentrations. You can tell right now that the driving force is going to be positive in some way, because it's going to push it outside of the cell. Okay, I think that's that. Now let's start talking about action potentials. Okay. just going to real quickly draw an action potential. And then we're going to have something here called threshold. What's that? So threshold, in order for an action potential to occur, you have to get up to negative 50. And once you get up to negative 50, an action potential absolutely will happen. Now you have something called a graded potential. As these signals are being sent in the cell, some of the stimulus for the signals isn't quite strong enough. So you'll see something like this. So it'll go up and down and maybe even down and back up. And it's not quite strong enough to get an action potential. But with a graded potential, if your stimulus is repeated, so let's say we have a pretty small stimuli, however you want to say that. So let's say it's just like that, but it's repeated. Well, it'll grow the next time, and then it'll grow, and then finally it'll get so high that you'll get an action potential. Ooh, that's bad. And that's what an action potential looks like. And just to kind of name what's going on here, so here we have depolarization, or our rising phase. Then we have repolarization, or our falling phase. And then we actually have hyperpolarization. Okay. So hyperpolarization. Well, let's start introducing some of the proteins that help an action potential to happen. So there's two proteins that we need to talk about. And that is a voltage gated channel. And you're going to have one for sodium. And you're also going to have one for potassium. So I'm just going to gated channel. Potassium there. Okay. Now this is what's happening. Once we get here, once we reach threshold, our sodium voltage gated channel, that's pretty sensitive to charge. So it's going to open quick. This will start to open, but it won't be all the way open until we get, up to the top. So now this is open. If you look at our concentration gradient, so we have a lot of sodium outside the cell, not enough sodium inside the cell, it's going to start rushing into the cell pretty quick. That's why we see this depolarization. Remember that the cell is sitting at negative 70, the outside's not at negative 70, so it's polarized. When all those positive charges come in, it's going to depolarize, and sorry, I should have drawn this. So it's going to go to 0 and then past 0 to go up to 30. Yeah, so that's going to rush into the cell. It'll stop coming into the cell around the top. Okay, and then, like I said, our potassium voltage gate channel will eventually open, but it takes a little bit for it to actually get there. So that's open. That's when we see our repolarization. So potassium will start rushing into the cell, right? So it's positively charged. Sorry, it will not start rushing into the cell. It will rush out of the cell. If you look at our concentration gradient, we got a lot of potassium inside the cell. It's highly concentrated, and low potassium outside of the cell, so it wants to leave. And it will do that all the way up to here. So this is where our usual, resting potential was, or where it was before. The reason why it's just slower to close, so then you get hyperpolarization where it's more polar, it's more negative, the inside of the cell is more negative than what the original resting membrane potential was. And I think that's what you need to know for that. One thing that I should mention, we've got, it's called an absolute refractory period. And then after that, we've got a relative refraction period. Basically what this means is in between this time, when your action potential is going on, you absolutely cannot have another action potential. No matter how much stimulus you put in, it's just not going to happen. Now, with the relative refractory period, you can actually have another action potential happen. The only thing with that is your stimulus has to be greater. Your stimulus has to be greater than, there has to be a little bit more stimulus in order to overcome hyperpolarization. You have to do that much more in order to get it to actually fire. And I think that's it for that. Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to draw out a neuron real quick. This is going to be our myelin sheath. That's our myelin sheath. And then this is going to be our sodium voltage gated channel, right? Now, a couple things we want to talk about. First one that's important is going to be length constant. And then the second one is going to be our capacitance. So, when an action potential occurs in our depolarization, this is what we're mainly going to focus on. So you have a bunch of positive ions coming into the cell. Now those positive ions will have something that we call the length constant. The length constant is how far their influence reaches, if that makes sense. So it could go there, or it could, it could get so small that it doesn't make it to the next sodium voltage gated channel. So this, we want it to propagate. We want it to keep going. And if I draw get another myelin sheath going here. This is kind of what it looks like, right? So we want this signal to make it all the way to there. But there's a couple things that influence how far this length constant is going to be able to go. One of those is capacitance. capacitance equation for it, or an equation that helps explain it, Q over, what is that, V, yeah. V is voltage, Q is the number of separated charges. So, when we have sodium's, let me try and explain this right. Okay. So capacitance. So let's look at our Q. So number of separated charges. Let's do it outside the myelin sheath first. So our Q, the number of separated charges, so we've got 5. 5 separated charges. Yeah. So let's see if we write this up here. We got 5. 5 separated charges. Now let's say yeah, I'm just doing this for my own purposes, I guess. So if you got 5 and each is at 1 volt, that means you've got your capacitance is equal to 5. That's a high capacitance. The higher the capacitance, the harder it is for your signal to propagate down because you have all these negative charges. These negative charges are going to take up, you know, some of this signal until you don't have any signal left. And the less negative charges you can have in there, the less capacitance you can have, the further that's going to be able to go. Now, taking into consideration, each one of these charges, like charges, repel each other, right? Well, they're having to get so close right here that they're actually expending energy pushing against each other. So they don't have a lot of energy to put towards keeping those charges. Now with capacitance over here under the myelin sheath, so here you've got, what is it, C, you've got 3. Do 3, 1, equal to 3. That's a lower capacitance. And look at what we have. Our negative charges are less under the myelin sheath. That helps our signal. So if our signal reaches the myelin sheath, it's going to be able to go and eventually reach the next sodium voltage gated channel. Yep. I believe that's it. I think that's everything I need to talk about.